All right. Welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. Today we have Dr. Chris Kirk. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me on. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for coming on. Obviously, I think I stumbled across your stuff. I think it was on Twitter. I think I stumble on most people's stuff on Twitter because I don't generally use Instagram because my phone doesn't work. And my Instagram doesn't work if I'm connected to Wi-Fi on my phone. My phone is like 5 years old. So I spend my time on Twitter finding things. But for people who may not be familiar with who you are, do you want to maybe give a brief background of yourself, kind of what you're doing, and then we're going to dive into some of your PhD research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually a lecturer in sport and exercise physiology at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. I've been in education, like teaching and lecturing, since 2006, but only in higher education since 2018. But I've also been working as a strength and conditioning coach, working with amateur and professional athletes since 2014, 2015. And I've been research active, specifically looking at combat sports and MMA since 2012. So I've got a few different hats and a few different balls up in the air pretty much all the time.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I actually want to dive into some of that research because there's some really good papers in there. And I think a lot of stuff that's applicable for just the everyday MMA fighter, or even everyday just combat sport athlete within there. But maybe we want to let's start at anthropometry. So maybe just for listeners, anthropometry, that might be a scientific term, just define what anthropometry is, and then maybe if any of these things actually dictate MMA performance, or maybe based on someone's anthropometry, are there certain styles that maybe someone should maybe focus on?
Yeah, so quite simply, anthropometry is the science of measuring the body. So anthro means man, in this case human, and metry is just measurement. So when we talk about anthropometry, we're really talking about, can we measure different segments of the body to try and get an understanding of how that body shape will perform in certain sports. So for instance, it can be as simple as basketball players will be more successful if they're taller, to Olympic weightlifters may be more successful if they've got shorter limbs. It can be something as simple and straightforward as that. And some parts of anthropometry go into really fine measurements, like the difference between this part of the phalange versus that part of the phalange can be a difference for spin bowlers in cricket and fast bowlers in baseball.
Okay, yeah.
And that's even been linked to swimming performance as well. Strangely, I don't know if that's just a bit of an artifact of you have certain limb lengths are good for swimming, or if there is actually something to that. Now, the big one in combat sports is the whole thing of height and reach. So before a boxing match or before an MMA fight, we always have the two photos of the fighters put up with their age, height, weight and reach. And this kind of comes from, traditionally in boxing, because the thought process is if you've got longer arms or a longer wingspan, you'll be able to strike your opponent more often and they won't be able to come in and strike you. Now, when did I first start looking at this? I think it might have been around 2014, 2015, when I read I can't remember the name of the book, but it was, the name of the author's gone as well. I'll drop you a message to put in the notes. Yep. But essentially there was a chapter in this book where it was looking at the statistics from UFC matches and looking at the height and wingspan of MMA fighters. And they found that the champions in each division at that point had longer wingspans and were slightly taller than the average in that weight class. So I think the champions at the time were John Jones, who's obviously known for having a very long wingspan. Anthony Pettis was lightweight champion, very long wingspan in comparison to most of the lightweights. And the conclusion of this chapter was essentially, having a longer reach makes you a better MMA fighter, makes you more likely to win. So I decided to, look at that. Does it actually give a better chance of winning or not? So in order to do this first study, I was up every Saturday night watching the fights anyway. At the start of each fight, I just take a quick screenshot on my phone of the height and reach data and collect that over the course of a year. So by the end of that year, I had 400 individual height and reach measurements.
Yeah,
and we'll come on to the caveats of these measurements in a moment, because there are a few woolly issues around these measurements. But essentially, I found that there was no difference in the height and reach on average between the winners and losers of any MMA fight. And there was no difference in the height and reach between champions and non-champions, or people who fought for a title and those who hadn't fought for a title. I found that there was no difference in, if you took the top 100 fighters in each division and split them into 3 levels, upper, middle and lower, there was no difference in the height and reach between those levels as well. So this led me to the conclusion that the idea of height and reach is greatly overstated in MMA. Now, it seems there is an effect in boxing. A study by Birmingham, I think it was, who I believe is an Eastern European researcher, they found that a longer reach does mean you're more likely to win in boxing. So what's the big difference between boxing and MMA? Well, it's the grappling. As soon as you get in close, as soon as you grapple someone and get hold of them, the length of their arms is virtually irrelevant. And once you get onto the ground, again, the length of your arms and length of your legs in comparison to your body, virtually irrelevant. So I think the idea of height and reach being important in MMA specifically is greatly overstated. Now, could that be because we have such wide weight division categories in MMA, and people do so much weight cutting that when you actually get into your division, there's not that much difference in height and reach between the opponents anyway. Now, the caveats around that is, how has height and reach been measured in these athletes? The answer is, we don't know. Yeah. And there's, you see a couple of things online where people, I think it was, or in fact it was Daniel Cormier, someone had the height and reach data of 3 Daniel Cormier fights, and his height changed by about 4 or 5 inches between those 3 fights.
Yeah, it's the same. So, even when you see stats of rugby players on the TV, I know they often overinflate the weight and the height just on the stats.
Yep.
You know? So I'm sure they do the same on, from the UFC or whatever other organisations are printing the stats.
Well, and I think that happens. It definitely does happen in basketball as well, because in rugby, basketball, if you're trying to get picked up by a pro club, you've much more chance of, in rugby, being picked up if you're 6'5" and 110 kilograms than if you're 6'2" and 90 kilograms. Same thing in basketball. I grew up playing basketball. At a basketball camp, I met Steve Nash once, and at the time he was listed as 6'3". I'm 6'4", and he was around there on me. Steve Nash definitely not 6'3", but really being a young Canadian lad, increasing your height a little bit gets you a bit more noticed by the coaches. Yeah. There might be a similar thing happening in combat sports and MMA, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. Is there, I guess, so while there's not much difference maybe in terms of outcome of the fight based on your anthropometry, is there, I don't know if you cover maybe like certain styles that may be better suited for different, I guess, limb lengths and body shape and things like that?
Yeah, this is actually something that I do want to look at, because I did do another paper in I did it in 2018, but by the time it ended up in publication, it was 2020. And this was looking at the in-bout statistics of number of strikes thrown, number of distance strikes, number of clinch strikes, number of takedowns, so on and so forth, and tried to find if there was any relation to any of these techniques and limb length, stature, the what's colloquially called the ape ratio, which is the scale between a person's height and their wingspan. And we found that really there's very few strong relationships between these things. But we did find that in some divisions, or the heavier divisions, heavyweight in particular, the longer your reach was, the more chance you have of scoring a knockdown. Whereas at featherweight, the greater height you were, I think it gave you a better chance of actually scoring a takedown. Now, we can't draw many conclusions from that at the moment, because we do need to have a better understanding of, well, what is a fight style? How do we determine whether someone's predominantly striking, predominantly grappling, or likes a mixture of them? 15 years ago, that would have been fairly straightforward, because there were a lot of people who were wrestlers who learned to box, or kickboxers who learned to stuff a takedown. In the current era, you don't really get many people like that. Everyone seems to be a true mixed martial artist. So in order for us to do that kind of study, we need to figure out a reliable way of measuring someone's fight style. Now, Dr. Oliver Barley from Australia, him and one of his students actually put out a paper where they asked the individual fighters to rate their own fight style on a 100-point scale. So 100% striker at one end, 100% grappler at the other end. And they asked them to literally rate whereabouts on the scale do you think you are. They didn't necessarily validate it, but they showed that it could potentially be doable, it could be possible.
Yeah.
So I think that is something that does need looking at, because it might be a case of we have so many people focusing on strikes just into a grapple that skews the data.
Yeah.
So if you went into a cage and thought my entire aim is just to stay on the feet, just stay striking, just stay at distance, then yeah, limb length might well make a difference there. But if you're going in the fight thinking, okay, I'm going to set up a few jabs to get in close, get the clinch, get a takedown, then maybe you might have a long limb length, and your long limb length on the jabs might be helping you gauge the distance to get the takedown, but it's not necessarily reflected in any of the other statistics. And I think there's a really good reflection of just how complex MMA is as a sport. There's so many different things going on and so many different determinants going on that really pinning down where that influence is or isn't, I think is going to be really tricky. But that is something I want to look at some point in the next couple of years. Yeah,
that'd be very, very interesting as well. And I wonder if, I don't want you to basically to be like, yeah, you should be in this weight class based on your height or whatever. But maybe if someone's struggling to figure out kind of what weight class they should be in, if they should cut down or kind of bulk up to move up, is there maybe a way for someone to determine, hey, I'm this tall, I know generally that this weight class might be a better fit for my body type?
I think to a certain extent, coaches are already doing that. And I think to a certain extent, coaches tend to do that more based on height and actual how thick the person looks in terms of musculature. So I think at the moment, if you're going into an MMA gym wanting to fight and you're 6'2", 6'3", I think the coaches are already looking at you thinking middleweight. Because if you look at most of the middleweights at the elite levels, they're about 6'2", 6'3". If you're going in at 6'2", 6'3", but you're pretty much your build, lots of muscle, typical rugby player body, then the coach is probably thinking, we're not going to be able to cut that person down. Let's make them even stronger and make them effective for heavyweight. So I think coaches are already doing that based on general body shapes and sizes anyway. Whether someone can use it to think, well, what's going to be a better weight class for me? How much weight should I be cutting? From a safety standpoint, I think that much more needs to be done from what is the person's energy availability, what is their resting metabolic rate, how much fat are they actually carrying at that point. I think that's going to be far more important and far more usable to determine someone's weight class rather than just how long do their bones happen to be.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And you mentioned, obviously, you took pictures of all the height and reach of all those fights. Does that mean you're staying up to like 3 a.m. to watch these fights because you're in the UK, right? Isn't the time zone not favourable?
Unfortunately, my entire life I've been watching sports that don't happen in the country where I live. So like I mentioned, I grew up playing basketball, so the NBA finals every year, I was staying up till 5 a.m. to watch Michael Jordan win another ring. And now, every Saturday, unfortunately, the main card actually starts around 3 a.m. here and finishes around about 6 a.m. These days, I'm only staying up for the big cards, so like the big title fights, and then everything else I'll watch the morning after. But there was a good 10-year period where every Saturday night I'd be up till 6 a.m. watching the fights and getting up bleary-eyed at 12 o'clock the following day wondering why I did that. But that's what happens when you're obsessed with something, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's all for information for the listeners on this podcast. So it all comes to fruition in the end. But I wanted to go into one of your other papers as well. I guess we could call it periodization for the MMA fighter, maybe, essentially. So do you want to maybe dive into maybe some of your findings in that paper regarding, I guess, training structure for MMA fighters, maybe things you found, tips maybe that you can give to fighters looking to schedule their own training weeks, months, however it is, and I guess anything else on that topic?
So I suppose this really brings me on to talking about the PhD that I recently finished at Liverpool John Moores University under Professor James Morton. The aim of my entire thesis really was to try and quantify what MMA fighters are doing in their training. Because I mentioned at the start of the podcast that I started research in 2012. That's when I became research active, and then at that point I was just about starting my masters in research at the University of Central Lancashire, and I went to the person who ended up being my supervisor, Dr. Howard Hurst, and with an idea about looking at whether breathing restriction methods are useful for MMA fighters to do during their training. Because I'd seen a video of Vanderlei Silva with headgear on, his nose all taped up, and then breathing through a snorkel whilst completed the circuit. Just absolute madness. But I looked at it and thought, well, maybe it does work. Maybe he's getting something from it. So I went to Howard and said, is this something we could research? Could we do a study on this? And he said, right, first we need to do, what information do we already know about MMA? And he sent me away to find every paper that I could on MMA. And I could find 5.
Yeah,
there's 5 studies.
Yeah. Well, even now there's only maybe a few dozen, maybe. You know, there's not too many still. Or you got more now than deep dive.
There's more now, but there's still not that many.
Yeah.
I ended up having a very similar conversation with James Morton when I started my PhD, and then we found 120 in total.
Wow.
So there has been a bit of a step up, but if you look at how many papers that are released on soccer, on association football, it's about 120 a year, not 120 in the entire existence of the sport. But because there was only 5 papers in 2012, we had to come right back to square one and find out, well, what is the sport? What are they doing? How can we measure the external load and the internal load? So my master's was essentially figuring out the reliability of accelerometry for measuring the external load and then measuring individual movements. Now, the question I had after that was, well, what does an actual training session look like? How can we measure what the fighters are doing in a regular training session and quantify what they do on a day-to-day basis? And it took me a bit of time. I was applying to a few different PhD scholarships, being unsuccessful at each stage because of just how competitive these things are, and eventually I was able to get a place at Liverpool John Moores, but I still had that question, what are they actually doing in their training sessions? So that became the first study of my PhD, actually observing MMA fighters doing their regular training with no intervention for 8 weeks. 8 weeks was just a solid block of time where we could get people consistently in every session, and we did that research at 4 different clubs, starting off with 25 participants. A few people got injured, a few people dropped out of the study, which happens with these kind of things, and we ended up being able to track 14 fighters for 8 weeks, collecting their sessional rating of perceived exertion to get their internal load. We had 2 weeks at each club where they wore catapult accelerometers to get their external load, and we measured their fatigue through fatigue questionnaires and reaction time. And what we found over the 8 weeks, I personally was expecting to see some sort of undulation over the course of the 8 weeks. So there'd be some days where they'd be really intense, other days where they wouldn't be that intense. Some weeks where they'd be really intense, other weeks where they weren't as intense. But instead what we found across the 8 weeks was nothing changed. There was no change in the training load, there was no change in the intensity, there was no change in volume, and as such there was no change in their fatigue levels. Now we got lucky with this study as well for one part of it. It just so happened that of these 14 participants, 7 had fights during the 8 week period. So half the group, just done luck, we ended up with a nice experimental comparison between the 7 people who fought and the 7 people who didn't. Even comparing these 2 groups, there was no difference in their training load. There was no difference in the intensity, no difference in the volume, up until the week of the fight, where the guys who were fighting just didn't train. Obviously, that's the weight cut week. So there was no 2 week taper. There was no what we would recognise as periodisation. There was no undulation. There was nothing that you would recognise from a physiological standpoint of this person's getting ready for athletic competition.
Yeah.
Which part of me was surprised at and part of me wasn't, because I've been around MMA gyms and combat sport gyms for over a decade. I've already seen how people train, but I was still expecting some kind of change to occur in the lead up to competition. I actually thought it would go the other way. I thought that intensity would just increase, and then drop off. The fact it just stays the same was what was surprising for me.
Okay, that's interesting. So I guess the questions from here would be then, how would you then like to see a week structured in terms of that undulation regarding the intensity? And then with the accelerometer data, I know in the paper you mentioned, obviously it covers, I think it measures the movement, but doesn't measure, I can't even remember now what it was saying. But there was something that it didn't measure within the training that was missing, but you're able to get some of the movement essentially out of measuring. So is there maybe something that you believe should be manipulated, or how it should be manipulated, especially within a class structure where it might be quite difficult, where obviously you've got a lot of different fighters going at once. You're maybe training different skills each day, or even separate parts of the day. So maybe you need to do some kind of intensity within this skill and this skill. So is there maybe a way that you would see as a good way to represent a training week?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head for the problem for most MMA gyms and MMA as a sport overall. The fact that you might have 40 people on the match training at any one time, of those 40, there might only be 10 who are active competitive fighters. And now I'm not talking about American Top Team, I'm not talking about American Kickboxing Academy, I'm not talking about the big ultra gyms. They're the 1%. I'm talking about the 99% of all other MMA fighters. You could have 40 people on the mats, 10 people who are fighters, and 3 of those people are getting ready for fights. One person could be getting ready for a fight in 2 weeks' time, one person could be getting ready for a fight in a month's time, and one person might have only just booked their fight 3 months down the line. So if we have an environment where everyone's doing completely different things, 3/4 of the people there are paying customers who are keeping the lights on, and only a quarter of people are there to actually get better and become competitive fighters, the coach has a really, really difficult job to do there. How do you bring in these changes and undulations in training load? It's not like working at a football club or a rugby club where everyone's on the same timetable and needs to be doing the same thing. So that's a really big problem. Now, what we also found in the training load study was that we were able to differentiate which types of training were more and less intense. So we split it into jiu-jitsu style training, striking style training, and wrestling style training. Just the 3 basic elements of MMA. And then we had the same 3 things again, but for sparring. Now, we found that the most intense type of training was obviously MMA sparring, wrestling sparring, and wrestling drills. The 2 least intense were striking drills and Brazilian and the jiu-jitsu drills. But the jiu-jitsu drills were as intense as the striking drills. But the coaches and the people in the sport, and myself included before this study, the view is that the jiu-jitsu sessions are the least intense, and that the jiu-jitsu sessions are by far and away the easiest sessions. But actually the jiu-jitsu sessions are as intense as striking drills and are not that less intense than wrestling drills. So we use the RPE scale to determine the intensity of each individual drill. And I can't remember quite off the top of my head, but I think Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu drills came in at around about a 4 on the RPE scale. Wrestling drills were only a 5. So it's only 1 AU above. But people view wrestling drills as being ultra intense, Jiu-Jitsu drills being the easiest thing we do. So what we found in each session where there was Jiu-Jitsu drills, they do a long duration of Jiu-Jitsu drills and really short duration of wrestling drills. But because of the way the SRPE method of measuring internal training load works, they were getting the same load for both of these things. So that's what I think was the cause of this flat loading pattern across the week. You'd have, just for instance, Tuesday, where they very much focus on Jiu-Jitsu. And then Thursday, they very much focus on wrestling. They do short wrestling long Jiu-Jitsu sessions, but the load balances out. They're essentially getting the same training dose on each day. So I think that in order to bring about those changes in training load, I think if coaches are given a better understanding of how intense each type of training is and how we can use the durations more effectively within their normal class structure, that could bring about that undulation. And if you've got, let's say, out of those 5 fighters who are getting ready for a fight, you've got 2 guys who are getting ready for a fight in the next couple of weeks, then maybe we could develop a system where we're able to say, okay, so you two guys are getting ready for a fight in 3 weeks. Your intensity needs to be going up, or your volume needs to be going up. So you guys are going to do 2 more rounds of these wrestling drills. Whilst everyone else is stretching off, you guys do another 10 minutes of these wrestling drills to get that volume up a little bit more, to get that intensity up a little bit more. If you need to do your pre-taper intensity, get it up to a 9 or a 10, okay, you're just going to do wrestling sparring. You're just going to do 2 rounds. I want you to go as hard as you can in this wrestling sparring. Try and keep it at a 9 or a 10, and then you're done for the day. You guys just do the first hour and then go. I think that is our starting point for figuring out how we can manipulate the technical tactical training to bring in those undulations. Again, that's just based off the data we have at the moment. Whether this system works in practice, we've got another 10 years of research to do on that yet.
I'm sure you can also, I guess, manipulate training partners as well, right? So if one guy needs the intensity, you bring in someone of similar skill level that they often train with, that they, like, for example, like, as people who maybe practice combat sports, you know, like, there's certain guys you train with that you can get really good, I guess, rounds in with, and there's other guys that aren't as good, you know, you can almost just relax and chill, so you can almost manipulate intensity that way too. But obviously that takes more planning and being able, you know, having everyone there as well. So that's obviously another factor.
Yeah, and with that, and that would absolutely be a useful method as well. But then you're kind of restricted as to where the person is living and training. Yeah. So if you're at a club or a gym in a big city where there's 6 or 7 other MMA gyms, then you are going to be able to travel around quite easily and find those people who can push you. Around where I live, it's a lot of small towns dotted around with only a couple of MMA gyms between us. So people have to travel long distances to get different partners who can really, really push them. But that's why when people turn pro and they start getting up to that point where they're getting noticed by Bellator, PFL, UFC, that's when they tend to actually move to the bigger gyms anyway, because they have to get those training partners who can push them and make them more intense, both on a skill and fitness level.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I love the idea of using accelerometry within MMA. Like, within combat sports, like, I believe that's almost like the future of at least the research, because, as you mentioned, there's nothing there. Every other sport has a time motion or needs analysis on them. You know, they cover this much distance, this intensity, blah, blah, blah. Combat sports just don't have it. And I think that's something that will come in the future. But I think it was in the paper when you mentioned about the accelerometer. It doesn't measure strikes. So obviously you can move around. If you're throwing a punch, it's not going to pick that up as essentially a load on the accelerometer. So I guess, is there anything, I guess, being developed in that area to be able to really quantify what happens in training or in a cage or whatever? So the accelerometry, I think, is a really interesting area for us to go down. And for the listeners who haven't seen the type of accelerometers we're talking about, the ones that I use are by a company called Catapult. And they're about... Yeah, I've got the shirt. I got sent this shirt yesterday, so there you go. Nice.
People from Catapult, if you're listening, I've done loads of promotion for you guys. I'm not getting any merch yet. Where's my t-shirt? Anyway, so the accelerometer, it's about that big, and it sits just in between the shoulder blades in a harness. Anyone who watches rugby union will have seen the lumps in between the players' shoulder blades. That's essentially what the players are wearing. What it allows us to measure is how much change and acceleration the person's body goes through whilst they're playing their sport, which is really, really useful for a sport where distance doesn't matter, such as combat sports, where time of movement doesn't necessarily matter, but actual movement does. So we've done 3 or 4 papers now using accelerometry and found that it is reliable for measuring how much movement they do during a takedown, during a strike, and during submission movements on the ground. Well, we have a study that is we're in the process of currently writing up another study where we try to compare the accelerometry data to the rate and perceived exertion data, so the internal load to the external load. And we're finding fairly solid relationships between the two. So anything from, on a correlation scale, anything from 0.9 down to about 0.6 is where they tend to be. The lowest ones, however, are in the grappling, where it's round about 0.4.
Okay.
Now, the reason we think for that is because the accelerometers, the catapult units, were designed for Aussie rules football and rugby. So 2 sports where the people are on their feet, running around a lot, not a long amount of time spent on the ground. There is some time on the ground, obviously, but as soon as a player can get up, they're back on their feet and they're running again. So the actions on the ground, where you're grappling with someone, you've got someone in your guard, avoiding punches, trying to control their arms, your torso's not moving that much. But you're working really hard. You've got a lot of isometric movements in your legs to try and hold guard. You've got a lot of isometric actions on your arms, trying to pull their arms down. You've got a lot of head movement, a lot of hip movement, but your torso's not moving. So we find that the accelerometry is great for measuring large movements, but the isometric actions, the small limb actions that are vital and are really difficult in the jiu-jitsu side of it, they don't get picked up so much by the accelerometry. So what I'd like to see if we can do is develop different algorithms to fit onto the accelerometry data that will allow us to match up if someone's spinning for an armbar, or if someone's trying to get in position for a sweep, or if someone's literally just moving their head trying to avoid getting struck in their guard. Can we pick out those actions in the accelerometry trace to make it a bit more accurate? Whether it's possible, I don't know. I've seen a few different studies that they've done in discus throwing, where they were able to pick out the accelerometry readings that would tell you whether a discus throw is correct or not. But that took years of biomechanical studies using force plates, using motion capture cameras. And again, throwing a discus is one movement. You'd have to do that same thing for someone getting up from guard, someone going for a sweep, someone spinning an armbar, someone punching. Whether that's possible or not, I don't know. Now, I am aware that there is a company that has developed an accelerometer that would go under the hand wraps in the boxing glove. And apparently they've got fairly good reliability data that it can recognise when you're throwing an uppercut, or whether you're throwing a series of crosses, whether you're throwing a hook to the body, whether you're just covering up. But they're very much valid. I don't know if they're fully validated yet, but they have been shown to be reliable. But they're reliable only for stood-up boxing actions. You'll know a boxer stands like that, an MMA fighter stands like that. They're two different movements. Are the accelerometers reading those actions differently? So I agree. I think accelerometry is one of the key methods that we're going to have moving forward for combat sports. Is it ever going to be perfect? No. But is there anything else that we can do that's going to give us as much information about the movement as accelerometry? I don't think time motion analysis gives us that accuracy. I don't think video analysis gives us that accuracy. I think accelerometry is the way to go, but there's quite a lot of work to do in that field as we currently stand.
Yeah, for sure. Could you wear potentially the wrist-worn accelerometer plus the one on the back to potentially marry that data up? Because then you're getting the torso and arm movements, maybe? I'm not too sure, but that could be something.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And again, that would be work to try and marry up the actions that we're doing between the accelerometers to see, well, what's the final output number. And I know there are also accelerometers designed for soccer now, which fit. I think at the moment they have them set up so they fit around the boot, but I think they're trying to make them smaller so they can fit inside the boot. And for football, it's looking like those are more accurate than the torso-worn ones for determining how fast someone's moving and when someone's moving. So these things have been developed all the time. They're getting better and smaller and more accurate all the time. It's just going to take a bit of work to figure out how they apply to what we want rather than what football, rugby, Aussie rules.
Yeah. Or what the cardio kickboxing people want, because there's like a million now. What are they? I don't know, punch trackers out there, but I don't think they're good enough for this, unfortunately.
No. It's like the difference between your Apple iWatch and your Garmin. They're two different things for two different markets.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned as well about the breath hold stuff. Did you ever go down the rabbit hole on that? Oh, not the breath hold, the breath restriction.
Breath restriction on
the how you mentioned at the beginning of your masters how you was it Vanderlei Silva had this smoke?
Okay. No, I just did a little bit more reading around what they were trying to do, and it's nonsense. It's not going to help, basically.
Okay.
So you see a lot of these power breathe.
Like Bart Rutten has a power train. I can't remember what it's called. But
he does, yeah. What those are able to do is essentially you're doing weightlifting for the muscles around your rib cage. So they allow you to strengthen the muscles around your rib cage, strengthen the muscles around your diaphragm, but it's not going to do anything to affect how well the lungs work or how well your body can utilise the oxygen it's bringing in or clear the carbon dioxide. It can't affect that in any way, shape or form. If someone's coming back from an injury where they've been sedentary for a long time, it can be a good starting point before they get back into full training. And I believe there are some modalities that swimmers use to reinforce them being able to hold breath and really expel the air, but it's very much a short-term thing. As far as improving DLT max, improving hematocrit, unfortunately they do nothing.
Okay, so they're not going to help you breathe, I guess, better during hard sparring or whatever it is that people say, or I don't know what else. I don't know what other claims they make on it, but I guess most people try and use it to... I don't think they use it when they're training now. I think they use it separately, right? It's like a separate training session on its own.
Yeah, I think the way the manufacturers say to use it is on your own, when you're sat in front of the TV doing like 30 deep breaths on the machine. There are some modalities I've seen in swimming where in between their lengths they'll pop their head up out of the water and have 2 really hard pulls on the power breathe. But again, that's very much for training of the diaphragm muscles and the muscles around your intercostal muscles. But if they're already strong, if they're already able to get your lungs up to their maximum capacity, that's as much as you're ever going to need. You're not going to get any further benefit. Okay,
no, that's good to know. So essentially, if you're already training, if you're already reaching like max heart rates or hard training, you've already developed that, essentially that strength of those muscles around the ribcage.
So if you've already trained to a point where you can get as much air into the lungs as can possibly fit in your lungs, then you're already at the point you need to be.
Gotcha. I want to come back to the training week stuff as well, with the periodization. So just based on that research and maybe your own experience as well, what would you, let's say best case scenario of how a training week you believe should look that would create that nice undulation, I guess, for someone who has an unlimited flexible schedule and can train whatever combat sport or part of MMA they want to on any time of the day. How would that look to you?
I believe that things should be as simple as possible, especially in a sport like MMA or any combat sport, where you are only preparing for one day that's 3 or 4 months in the future. Mm-hmm. So like in team sports, they've got to play 2 games a week, and they've got to be ready to go every couple of days and train around those as well. Sorry, one moment.
No, good.
So in team sports, you have to have quite complex periodization programs and have it very finely mapped out. In MMA, I don't think we need that complex periodization structure. I think, generally speaking, there are 4 things that fighters in MMA are trying to train. Their submission skills, their wrestling skills, their striking skills, and then how can they put it all together in sparring. I think we're really covering those 4 areas. So I personally think the easiest way to do it would be to pick 2 days of the week, which are the most intense days. Mm-hmm. So one day where you're spending most of the session in some form of sparring. That could be MMA sparring, it could be wrestling sparring, it could be kickboxing sparring, it could be just jiu-jitsu sparring, because those are the most intense types of sessions. We could get into a conversation later on about how much MMA sparring and kickboxing sparring people should be doing for head impact and for wear and tear. But I think generally speaking, you want one day where some form of sparring is being done. And then another day earlier on in the week where you're doing the more intense drill-based categories. So wrestling drills and a mixture of BJJ and striking drills, but done to the upper limit of their intensity. So around about a 6 or a 7 on the RPE scale is the upper limit for those types of categories. The rest of the week should be done around moderate to light intensity. So having prescribing striking drills to the lower end of the RPE scale, around about a 3. Grappling drills where it's to the lower end of the RPE scale for grappling, around about a 2. And mixing up those lower intensity drills around the low intensity days and having 2 days a week really targeted on this is where we're going to go hard. These are our intense sessions. They might only be an hour, but in those sessions we're going for it. I think if you get that simple week structure set up that fits the fighters' requirements and the gym's requirements in terms of when the coach is there, how many other people are going to be on the mat, then you can manipulate each of those days to bring the between week undulation up. And from there onwards, I think it's simply a case of changing the volume. So if you start off on week 1, the volume of grappling drills and the volume of sparring rounds is down here. Week 2, just increase it a little bit. Week 3, just increase it a little bit. And then the same on the next mesocycle. Rather than increasing the volume, we're going to go a little bit more intense. So rather than having your striking drills around a 3, okay, aim for your striking drills around about a 4 on the 0 to 10 RPE scale. I think having a simple, almost a linear block structure based around just manipulating how intense or how much work we're doing on each of these days, with 2 days a week where they go intense, I think that will be a really simple way of building periodization into the coach's technical tactical, the fighter's technical tactical training. And that's even before thinking about the strength and conditioning work that they would do alongside that.
Yeah, where would you put that in that kind of training week?
So the 2 intense days, we've already marked those out. We've got a sparring day, we've got a heavy wrestling day. So we would just have their more intense S&C sessions. Even if the fighter can only do two days of lifting per week, we'd just shuffle them 24 to 48 hours away from the most intense technical tactical days. Again, I don't think it needs a complex strategy. I think it just needs to be very basic on the lines of how would you set up a dead basic strength and conditioning plan if these are their most intense days. I don't think we need to go more intense than that. I think the more difficult side of the S&C is when are they going to be doing their conditioning? When are they going to be doing their cardio work? What is that going to look like? Which methods are going to be more appropriate for them? And from just going back to the training load study that we did, I think we had 408 individual training sessions that we analysed. Only 63 of those were strength and conditioning sessions. And of those 63, I think 70% of those strength and conditioning sessions were done by one person. What we found in this study was that MMA fighters don't really do strength and conditioning. They don't do the fitness work alongside it. And there were no sessions in the sample we had that could be described as cardiovascular training. So I think where it will get more complex is figuring out what type of cardiovascular training is going to complement the work they're doing on the mats, and how can we build that into that training week.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. And you obviously mentioned as well about the tape out, because obviously you talked about now increasing volume, increasing intensity, and then within your study you had fighters just literally just take the last week off and that was it, and everything else is the same. I guess you mentioned obviously having a 2-week taper. Do you want to maybe run down how someone listening to this could implement their 2-week taper going into a fight?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a caveat at this point is to say that 2-week taper is entirely based on the classic tapering literature that's out there, and all of that information is based almost entirely on heart rate and lactate readings taken from endurance runners. Okay, so when we talk about that 2-week taper, for most sports, it's very much a case of, well, it works for endurance runners, so we're going to kind of just trust that that's going to work for most of the sports, which, again, the dark secret of sports science is that's kind of what a lot of sports science is based on. It works in that sport, so we're just going to kind of assume it crosses over to this sport.
Yeah.
So for combat sports, there's virtually no data, or virtually any data, that shows that a 2-week taper is appropriate. The only thing that I can think of that really does lend credence to that 2-week taper being appropriate was a case study by Israel Halperin, who tracked a boxer just one boxer getting ready for a professional bout. And throughout the camp, they did a series of measurements, such as jumps, sprints. I think they did a punch speed test as well. That might have been with a line transducer, so I might be getting mixed up with another study there. But they took a series of measurements. And the fighter did their normal weight cut, got ready for the fight, had the fight, but their performance on each of these measures only peaked 4 days after the fight occurred. And the fighter did, I think, a 7-day taper, just in their normal training. Israel, I don't think, manipulated their training in any way. They just let the fighter do what they normally do. So if we're talking about having a 2-week taper, and that boxer's performance, physical performance, peaked 4 days after the fight, after a 7-day taper, that kind of fits in with a 2-week taper.
Yeah.
So if we're going to work on that 2-week taper, what we normally tend to use is keep the intensity of the work high as we can, and then have an exponential rapid drop off in the amount or volume of work that fighter's doing. So if we're looking at the technical tactical sessions, again, I think it's relatively straightforward. If we have those 2 intense days, then for that final 2 weeks, those 2 intense days, right, we're going to have you working at a 9 or a 10. So in your sparring, if you want to carry on sparring for those, well, again, we don't have to do MMA sparring because it's basically all around wrestling sparring. I want you to go at a 10, and you're going to do 2 4-minute rounds. And that's your entire session. So it's dropping off the volume, but keeping the intensity nice and high. For the drill sessions, if we're doing striking drills, I want you to work at 6, which is roughly the upper limit of what we saw for intensity of striking sessions. We're going to work you at 6 for these striking drills, but you're only going to do half an hour. That's your session done. So I don't think it requires a very complex method. Just work you hard and just drop that the amount of work you're doing. Just less time in each session. And one of my supervisors on PhD is Dr. Carl Lang-Evans, who does a lot of work with current UFC fighters from the Liverpool area. And that's the basic premise he's been working on for a few years. And he's been getting some really good results, both in terms of when the athlete's physical performance is peaking and how they're feeling approaching the fight as well. They're going into that final week weight cut, not feeling drained, not feeling tired, not feeling like they've done too much. If anything, they're doing a 10-minute intense, a 10 out of 10 intensity pad session and walking away going, I've got more in the tank, I've got more to give, which is exactly where you want them. You want them going into a cage thinking, I've got so much more to give, I've got so much more to do, rather than thinking, I just want to get this over and done with, I'm dead on my feet, which is what we see from most fighters. So I don't think it requires a very complex model. We've got the basic model of intensity high, drop the volume, let's just follow that.
Yeah, that's such a great place to be, like, psychologically as well. There's some good research as well, like obviously around fatigue. Obviously fatigue's multifactorial, but that psychology component is one of them, where you're basically comparing the perception of the effort you're doing now compared to previously. So if that used to be really hard, you're out on your feet, you're like, shit, like that's tough. And then you come in close to fight week and you're doing a similar session, but you're stopping it and you're feeling like, man, I can keep going. Like that's a huge psychological win, for yourself as the fighter going into whatever, knowing that, hey, I can give these efforts and I've still got a lot more to give as well. So obviously that taper helps keep that energy there, so you're not feeling drained after everything you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that psychological burden, you speak to so many fighters and so many of them will say they went into most of their fights thinking, I don't want to be here. I just want to get this over and done with and finish it and then just like go out with the lads or whatever. And that continuous psychological burn of, I've got to do this fight, I've got to do this fight, I've got to do this fight, that's going to add up more and more over time. Whereas just for their mental health, if they're going into the fight thinking, yes, now this is what I'm here for, this is the bit I love, that is only going to help them with their mental health over the course of their careers as well. So we do have to think about that alongside it.
Yeah. How, I guess, during the taper then, say the final week, obviously, maybe the acute weight loss strategies start coming in, 3 days before or something like that. I guess, would you stop the intense short sessions then, or is there some kind of other manipulation you're doing then regarding around the volume and intensity as you get to maybe acute weight loss strategies?
Generally speaking, what we see from MMA fighters is that the worst part of the weight cut is that 36 hours before their final weigh-in. That's when the dehydration methods really start to kick in. And in my opinion, as long as you do a very short but high intensity workout the day before they're starting that final dehydration to really drain themselves down, I think that's as close as you want to get. But again, it could just be a case of 10 minutes all out on the pads. It could be a case of 10 minutes all out in the gym doing trap bar jumps with a heavy loaded bar. 2 sets of 1. It could be something as simple and straightforward as that. But yeah, you definitely want to avoid any work once they're starting the dehydration phase, because that's a horrible couple of days for the fighter anyway. You don't want them worrying about doing extra work alongside that. And again, if you look at the work of Carl Lang-Evans, he did a paper last year with a Taekwondo fighter. That's an approach he took and got great results, and he gets great results in practice with that particular strategy as well.
Oh, awesome! I'm gonna have to go look at those papers. I'll get you to send me some of those papers, or a link to those papers, and I'll definitely go through those too.
Absolutely, yeah.
Perfect. I think we've actually covered everything I had questions wise, but is there anything else you wanted to add to the conversation, maybe for anyone listening? And then, if not, where can people look to follow, I guess, what you're doing, your research, and everything else?
What could we add for? Just on the weight cutting side of things, I would like people to understand exactly what's happening to the fighters when they are doing their weight cut. We always, and this is from a fan standpoint, we always tend to get into conversation of a fighter miss weights, or they're unprofessional, they're not tried, they're not done this, they're not done that. MMA fighters take weight cuts into the absolute extreme. As a rule of thumb, they're cutting their body mass by 8 to 14%. Boxers are doing about 5%, wrestlers are doing about 3 to 4%. The physiological toll that fighters are experiencing through this weight cutting practice is huge, and it is life-threatening. So I think from a research standpoint, we've got a lot of work to do in order to bring about safer methods, both in the short and long-term safety, and to help their performance. From a fan standpoint, I think we just need to look at what these fighters are doing and give them a bit of slack when they do miss weight by half a kilogram or a kilogram, because they are literally taking their bodies to the absolute limits of what is safe and healthy, and in fact, in most cases, beyond the points of safety and healthy. Yeah. So from a fan standpoint, if you see a fighter struggling to make weight, just have a bit of compassion for what they're doing and what's happening to them at that point. In terms of if people, do you want me to do contact details now, or? Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. If people want to contact me, I am on Twitter, which is at @ChrisKirk_ASP. That's also my name on Instagram, but I can't figure Instagram out, so it'd be better off contacting me on Twitter. Instagram does not work for me. In terms of contacting me by email, please feel free to contact me on my email address, which is c.kirk, which is KIRK, @shu.ac.uk. And if you're a fighter looking for advice or looking to work with me, contact me on that email. If you're someone who wants to get into research in combat sports, if you're interested in doing a PhD or a master's studying combat sports, contact me and we'll see what we can get set up for you at Sheffield Hallam. I'd very much like to chat with anyone who's interested.
Awesome. That's a lot of good stuff for anyone listening who wants to maybe get involved or contact Chris as well. You've got his direct email there. I'll put everything in the description too, so everyone can kind of go in there and see it too. But I appreciate your time, Chris, and thank you for coming on.
No worries. Thanks for having me, James. I very much enjoyed it.
Cheers.